Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's your boy Cash, and today we will be discussing the how should I say the fall from glory for Ferrari. Back in 2020, if you recall, they had the worst car they've ever had in I think the last 4 decades. About so now we're gonna discuss why that happened, what caused them to go from a front-running championship level team to being sixth on the grid. Well, not sixth on, like sixth in the championship, in the constructors championship. So to understand what went wrong in the 2020 season, we have to go back and understand the foundations that were being set for the 2020 season in the 2019 season. And in the 2019 season, Ferrari were actually extremely quick with Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc. But not just that, their car was incredibly fast. And there's a good reason for that. Now, what was being observed by many front-running teams was that on, how should I say, top speed dominant circuits, like say Monza, um, the Ferrari was extremely quick in a straight line compared to any other car on the grid. And the reason that other teams thought this could be the case, like why this might be the case, was because they thought Ferrari was cheating. They thought Ferrari was just well, they were breaking the regulations, and they had more horsepower being generated from their power unit compared to what was actually allowed from under the guidelines of the FIA. So, but then how do you prove that? How do you get from the point of saying that, okay, we think Ferrari is cheating, to definitively saying, okay, Ferrari is doing something that's outside the regulations and we want it outlawed? So first, let's walk through what the teams thought was happening, what the other teams thought was happening. And there's a simple, well, it's not exactly simple. I'm going to use this to kind of explain. Actually, this is not the best representation to explain, not because this is a McLaren, but because you can't really see components of the engine. Okay, anyways, it related to the fuel flow rate. Now, what is fuel flow rate? Fuel flow rate is the rate at which fuel can be supplied from the pumps, from like the fuel pumps, to the engine, right? And I think this was limited to 100 kilograms per hour. So yeah, that was the fuel flow rate that was determined by the FIA, and going above this would mean that you are breaching the regulations and you are in violation of the regulations. So basically your car is illegal. Now, how this was measured was using a fuel flow meter. Now, the fuel flow meter would measure the output through the fuel pumps into the engine about at a rate of 2.2 kilohertz, I think, if I'm not wrong, which, if you put it into layman's numbers, is 2200 times in 1 second. That's the number of measurements that were being taken. And even if one measurement was off, it would set off a red flag with the FIA. Because these readings were the readings of this sensor were how the FIA was able to verify that, okay, if a team is staying within the regulations or if it's going beyond them. Now, what Ferrari did was, of course, all teams use an e-pump, and an e-pump, essentially, you can switch it on and off multiple times very quickly, to the point where it can reach the same frequency as the fuel flow sensor, so which is the same 2.2 kilohertz. So what happened was, I mean, if you can plot it on a graph, what they did was that the trough of the graph, the lower end of the graph, they made that reading to be 100 kilograms per hour, to be equivalent to 100 kilograms per hour. That was the lowest that their pump was supplying fuel at, because essentially how it works is the pump isn't constantly supplying fuel. The pump switches on and off to give, like, how should I say, little bursts of fuel. And those bursts or what is measured. So there would be a point where there would be a lot of fuel being delivered, and there would be a point where not as much fuel is being delivered. So when not as much fuel is being delivered, that's when Ferrari intended for the reading to be taken by the sensor put in by the FIA, right? So essentially, when the fuel flow was at its lowest or towards the lower end, that's when the sensor would take its reading. And then when the sensor was off, in between the two readings, keep in mind 2200 readings per second. In between those two readings, the pump would activate and more fuel would be pumped into the engine by the pumps from the fuel tank, essentially creating more power. So it was estimated that this just this trick alone allowed Ferrari to gain another 65 horsepower, which is significant. Now, how this was discovered was quite interesting because other teams figured out, well, they didn't figure out how exactly it could be done. Red Bull was actually the front runner in kind of trying to expose Ferrari in this deal, because what they said was that they went to their own factory and they said that, okay, if we had to cheat the system, how would we do it? And they came up with like 3 or 4 different iterations of, okay, we can do this, we can do this, we can do the fuel flow thing, we can use excess oil from the radiators to try and like squirt a little into the engine compartment and like get a little bit of extra combustion. And they had these 3-4 iterations. They went ahead with that and they went to the FIA with their findings, and they asked the FIA, is this legal? And they asked the FIA to put out clarifications based on these findings that Red Bull had. The idea behind this was that if Ferrari was using any of those 3 or 4, or an amalgamation or a variation of these 3 or 4 principles that Red Bull had found, and then Red Bull brought them up to the FIA, and the FIA put out a technical directive saying that no, these things are not legal, that they are not permissible under the current set of regulations, then Ferrari would have to roll back those, technical innovations, and then that would sort of bunch up the field a little more, at least for Ferrari, right? Like they would they would lose their performance essentially. So, and immediately after the FI had put out these technical directives in light of the clarifications Red Bull had requested, what happened was that Ferrari's performance dipped significantly to the point where they were losing a few tenths every single lap, like compared to their previous car, like quite a few tenths. And now the problem for the 2020 season came here, that now, of course, your current season's car has been in development the entirety of the previous year, right? So that 2020 car was being developed around the 2019 engine, but the pre-outlawed 2019 engine. So how it worked was that car had a significant amount of drag that the older engine, the more powerful engine, was able to overcome. But when the technical directives were passed and the engine was nerfed, as if you can say, then the engine was not capable of overcoming that drag coefficient of the car, which is why if you look at the on average lap times between the 2019 Ferrari and the 2020 Ferrari, you will see a 1 second increase in lap time. So the 2020 car was a second a lap slower than the 2019 car, and this is essentially what contributed to the downfall, we can say, of Ferrari. Yeah, that's basically